Welcome to Vineyard Christian Fellowship, week 13 of the lockdown, but the last week of the lockdown. We just got news this Friday that we're able to open up again next week. We will be doing that for Father's Day. We'll have some information going out this week, a few more things being said at the announcement time, but happy days are here again. So let's see. If we could grab our donuts, especially my granddaughters, make sure you have your donuts. And then you can turn and fist bump your social distance neighbor, and we'll get this service on the road.
What have I in this life but the light in your eyes? This empty world one day fades. Only your truth Jesus, all I have.
still we praise our Savior in spirit and in truth. For we cannot say enough about you, but still we praise. But still we praise our Savior in spirit and in truth. For we cannot say enough about you. For we cannot say enough about you.
Something that is peculiar about us, the way God created us, is we have this desire to take sides on any issue, on any decision. Maybe that's the result of partaking of the apple of the knowledge of good and evil. We also look at Jesus' disciples, of whom we've joined that band. And if you look in the Gospels, they took sides. And yet Jesus calls us to a place of unity, which I actually don't understand, especially in our society today. But we do know a couple things. God has told us that we need to take the perspective of those who are traveling with us seriously. And because that's so hard to do, and I have a tendency to forget that, look at it another way. Pick the person that has the opposite viewpoint of you that's also following Jesus, and consider that person God's favorite. Because as odd as it sounds, in the kingdom of heaven, we are all God's favorite. And as we go through this life that God has called us to, there's so much information out there. And whatever perspective that you have, you can find a host of places to have all the facts and all the anecdotal evidence support that. And another word that we want to add to this is that the only thing that God is requiring of you is that His voice is also taken into account. And in that way, collectively and individually, we will not be tossed to and fro like a double-minded person. God's on the move, and this is His way.
Good morning, and we are here with some exciting news. Exciting news, Jim. There has been a new press release. Jim's is so excited, you guys. There's been a new press release, and we can be together again 1 week from today on Father's Day. Limited capacity and with a bunch of new rules. We're going to send out information this week with what you can expect when you come and what we expect from you when you come. But bottom line, we get to be together next week, and we couldn't be more happy about that. Right, Jim?
For all us introverts, I have some sad news for you. Next week, we're going to get back together again.
Yeah. Sorry, Ben. It's time you have to leave
Yes.
the house again.
Yeah, really. So,
Yeah.
I think, if you want to stay in your cave, that's fine.
That's
I'm going to stay in mine. So,
Whatever. He can't wait. He can't wait to be together again. But we do want to sing a birthday song this week. We have one birthday, but
Okay.
it's a special one
all right.
for a person who wears many hats and who has many titles.
Oh, I think
Yeah.
I know who you're talking
Yeah. You may call him friend. You may call him pastor. You may call him Faja, but whatever you call him, Pastor Doug's birthday is this Saturday, June 20th, and he is our birthday song this week. Are you ready?
about. Any other options of what I can call
There's
him?
plenty of other options, but
Okay,
not so many
all
we can
right.
name on camera.
I
Let's just watch him, Jim.
totally agree.
Okay.
I totally agree.
So let's sing happy birthday to Doug.
Okay.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Dad.
Pastor.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday.
That's what Gene calls him.
El Pastor?
El
Yes.
Pastor.
Yes. Isn't there like a taco El Pastor? It's
I don't
kind of
know.
meat. It's a kind of meat.
Oh,
Yeah.
really? Okay.
Okay, go ahead. You're good?
I got nothing to say. I'm
Guys, this-
saddened about the news.
Yeah, you're gonna have to be social again. From a distance, but still social.
If God tells you to stay home,
Is God telling you to stay home, Jim?
I think so.
We'll be prepared to not
That's
see
right.
you. You can, we'll get a video announcement for you to send in next
You'll
week.
never see me alive again.
That's right. Don't let him fool you. He has been waiting for this moment.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, I valued myself as an introvert.
That's right. That's right. We will see you next Sunday.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, welcome back. We are going to get started with today's lesson, where this will be the lesson 2 of the series, Trust Completed in Death to Self. We just finished the series on trust or faith being the key to life without lack, life without fear. And we are moving into the idea that not only is faith or trust needed in our life, we need to die to self. That's how our trust is completed. Last week or last time I spoke on this, I did an introduction. I just want to make a couple points and then we will get into today's lesson. The first point I made, that this whole idea of death to self is just that. It's death to self, not the death of self. Because God has made us to be a self, a person, and to make a difference in this world. Second point is that death to self is not ultimately a negative thing, but rather it's a rising up into the very life of God. Quoting 2 Peter 1:4, where he talks about you may be partakers of the divine nature. So we pick up the divine nature, that's who we become. But the downside, the side that we lay down, is having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. So you can't have life without the death. Third point is that Jesus, when his disciples were trying to get him from going to the cross during that Passion Week, he gave this basic biblical teaching of unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain. Of course, that happened on the cross and in the resurrection and the new church. We talked actually about that last week. It was not just to lose life, but also to give life. Again, it's not just about the negative. There's something bigger that comes from that death. Because of this, it would be said of him that it was for the joy that was set before him that he endured the cross. It's important that we don't miss this truth, that there is joy, that there is goodness to the dying to self in what we get out of that. Because if we fail to incorporate that into our own experience, we'll miss the route to a life without lack, and we'll just live a pretty morbid, morose life of dying to things. I want to bring in a new thing here. It was interesting that just when we started to do the series on faith, I was finishing up my biography of J. Hudson Taylor, who lived a life of faith. And so I used a lot of illustrations from his biography to show pictures of what that looked like. It's also interesting that just now I picked up again a book that I haven't read in a long time, maybe 30 years, called The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. The Imitation of Christ. And it is said to be, next to the Bible, the most well-read book in the history of mankind. So it's a pretty important book back from the 1400s. And he talks a lot about what it takes to imitate the life and the ways of Christ. And in it, there's a lot of death to self. And so I realized that as I'm reading even the introduction and the preface, that there are going to be things that I'll be able to bring into this series. That's all to say, I've got a quote to begin with. He says this, and it's broken up into 4 different books, and the last couple books are Jesus speaking to him in his contemplation. And it says this, it says, "My son, to the degree that you can leave yourself behind, to that degree you will be able to enter into me." Again, let me repeat that. My son, to the degree that you can leave yourself behind or to die to yourself, to that degree will you be able to enter into me. We've talked a lot about how there's so much talk by Jesus about being in him and him in us, that there's this life to be gained that is the life that we are moving to, we are growing into, we are trying to attain. And I thought that this was really interesting because it says, basically, to the degree that we're able to die to ourselves, to that degree we're able to live to him, which is what we're trying to do. And so that's that thing of well, this is what I want, so yes, I will let go of myself so that I can get this greater good of what I want. And that is the route to the life without lack. And then lastly, I mentioned that the gospel is presented today with very little connection to the complete surrender of our lives to God. This surrender cannot be accomplished without trust, death to self, and love. And the idea is that we tend to use that word, that I surrender my life to God. And I'm not saying that we don't at all, but I just don't believe that we do it to the extent that that marks our life, a surrendering to somebody else's life. But as we do that, that opens it up, almost like Thomas à Kempis had just written, that opens us up to living the life that he has given to us. So I talked in the introduction a lot about what Jesus talked about this. Now let's take a look today, start off by looking at what Paul says about death to self. Now, of course, Paul knew the truth of Jesus' teaching about self-denial and death to self, and his letters are full of references to this principle about taking off the old man and putting on the new man. And of course, you can't put on the new one until you've taken off the old. But one of the most impressive examples appears in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. And while the whole chapter is profitable to read, here are some highlights. But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellence of the power may be of God and not of us. Okay, this treasure is in us, in earthen vessels. We are hard pressed on every side, and yet not crushed. We are perplexed, we're puzzled, we're troubled, we are uncertain, but we're not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. Always carrying about in our body, the dying of the Lord Jesus, the death of Jesus, that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our body. So it's basically saying that this is our life. Our life, it carries about the dying on one hand in our body, to our flesh, and we do that so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in that same body. He goes on to say, therefore we do not lose heart. Even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day, or renovated day by day, or revived day by day. For, or because, of our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us. There's a purpose for it, and it's doing its work, that a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. So the light affliction of what we are going through, now remember what he just said, light affliction, hard pressed on every side, perplexed, persecuted, struck down, always carrying about in the body the death. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. As in Jesus, for the joy that was set before him, he endured these things, knowing that there was something much, much better on the other side. While we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. It's perspective. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Perhaps as in no other place, Paul is expressing his confidence in God and demonstrating the way in which he lives, looking in hope to the eternal life that's found in God. Then, out of that place of confidence, the conviction of what was basic Christianity for Paul bursts forth a few verses later, where he says this, he says, the love of Christ compels us because we judge thus. But basically he says, because we have come to this conclusion, because we have come to this understanding, the love of Christ compels us. And what is it that the conclusion that we've come to? That if one died for all, then all died. Remember last week we talked about the grain and the seed and the grain, and out of one many, and out of many one. That if one died for all, then all died. So if Jesus died, then we died with him. And he died for all. Why? It finishes by saying, so that those who live should live no longer for themselves, but for him who died for them and rose again. For that purpose, for this purpose, that those who live should no longer live for themselves. This is what Paul saw as basic Christianity, that I should no longer live for myself, but that I should live for him who died for me and rose again. This is the essence of the death to self life, that we should no longer live for ourselves, but for him who died for us and rose again. And again, I struggle with this because I know this and I want to do this, and I would say that every day there is part of the day when I do this. I'm just not too sure that this is the foundation of my everyday, all day. And this is why it's so important for us to be looking at this and for us to begin to put these things into practice in our lives. To this we can add Paul's words from Galatians 2:20, where we see again the paradoxical way of presenting the believer's relationship to Christ. He puts these things in paradoxes, where he says, I have been crucified with Christ. Basically he's saying, I have been put to death with Christ. I have died with Christ or in Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. He's my new life. I'm dead to self, and Christ is my new life. And the life which I now live in the flesh, in this body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. This echoes the example of Jesus not loving his own life, as in protecting it. Remember, we've talked a while ago in the series about people in our attempts to save and enrich our lives and to enlarge our lives, protect our lives. And Jesus, he said, if you try to save your life, you're going to lose it. But if you lose your life, you will save it. And it means to protect it. But giving up his life as the foundation of our own lives in him. Then later in the same letter, Paul describes, again, what should be the normal Christian life. He says this, and those who are Christ's, which is us, have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. We see here the contrast between what Paul refers to as the flesh and the Spirit. It's the same contrast that he just talked about, the living to self and living to Christ, right? The flesh, Spirit, living to the self, living to Christ. But what's the flesh? What is that really talking about? Let's take a moment and flesh out what it means for the flesh. The first thing to be said is that the flesh is not bad in itself. Simply stated, the flesh is merely the natural powers of the human being. It's my natural powers based in my human body. It is my capabilities, my wants, my desires, as they are in and by themselves, unaided by the divine assistance or guidance. Let me repeat that, just so we get a good understanding of what the flesh is. It's simply stated, the flesh is merely the natural powers of the human body, human being based in the human body. It is our capabilities, our wants, and our desires as they are in and by themselves, unaided from the divine assistance or guidance. It's me on my own. The flesh is not identical to human nature, what we might term human nature, but simply one aspect of it. It is not to be thought of as being essentially sinful, fallen, or bad. Indeed, our bodies, our flesh, are intended to be members of his body, and our flesh and our life in the flesh is lived by the faith in the Son of God. We are to live a life in this flesh, in this body, that is a good life. And so, for example, we read in Galatians of a story from the Old Testament about Abraham and his servant Hagar, and how they gave birth to their son Ishmael. And in Galatians it says, according to the flesh. That is, in the way that normal human reproduction takes place. You remember the story. God shows up, tells Abraham and Sarah they're going to have a son. Sarah laughs because they're like really old, and they're thinking, there's no way we're going to be able to have a kid. And so they try on their own to figure it out without God's assistance. So Sarah knows she can't have a child, so she gives her handmaiden to Abraham, and they have a child. They do it on their own without God. And so Ishmael is their son, born according to the flesh, according to their plans, their normal way of doing things without God. This contrasts with the birth of Isaac, who is the one who finally comes through the promise of God, because that's exactly what Galatians says. It says, whose birth was through the promise. This was God's promise to Abraham, that the child would be born of Sarah, through the action of God in combination with the normal abilities of Abraham and Sarah. It's them being what they can be and God being what he can be, and he brings something about. Human beings have natural abilities, and those abilities are good when they are used in accordance with God's design and desires. The problem with the flesh lies in its weakness and lostness when uncoupled from God's Spirit. And let me repeat this, because this is where the problem comes from. It's with the flesh. The problem is in the flesh, in its weakness and lostness when uncoupled from God's Spirit, when it's away from God, when God is not moving with us. That is when we are left to our own devices, and that's when we get into trouble. And this is precisely the condition of humanity apart from Christ. This is the problem in the world to magnified, but it's also a problem with us, where we have not crucified or died to ourselves and try things on our own. To live in the flesh, which is to live with uncrucified affections and desires, is simply a matter of putting them in the ultimate position or authority in our lives. Let me repeat that again. What it means to live in the flesh is just to live with uncrucified or alive emotions and feelings and desires, and that all that means is that it's simply a matter of putting those things, our emotions and our feelings and our desires, as the ultimate position of authority in my life. They lead, we follow. And when that happens, when my feelings are leading me, when my emotions are leading me, when my desires are leading me, then I find myself walking according to the flesh. Whatever we want becomes the most important thing. This is what happens when we are living apart from God. We make our desires ultimate because they're all we have. We don't have God to lean on, to trust in, to see what he has for us. All we have is ourselves and our own power and our own mind to make sense out of things. And unfortunately, we fall under the power of our emotions and desires and feelings, which are very, very strong. I'm thinking of my worth, my glory, my appearance, thinking of my power or my ability to take care of myself. That's the only thing I've got to go on. Now, I might look to somebody else, but I am still taking what they have to say, running through my things, and if you look in the world, if you look in our own lives, we listen to who we feel like we ought to listen to. We listen to the epistemologist who we think has got the facts right, and we come up with our opinions, and we then go and argue with people who listen to other people's opinions. Let's take a second and look at the contrast between desire and spirit, because this is where the battle lies. Now, desire is essentially the impulse to possess or experience something. Again, a lot of definitions today. I want to repeat it again. To desire something, desire in us is essentially the impulse to possess something or to experience something. It cares for nothing else other than the object that it wants. Desire proclaims, as the old song puts it, I want what I want when I want it. We can think of an impulsive child as a child who is driven by strong emotions towards something, and all else needs to be put aside until I get what I want. Now, we may not go as crazy as a little child screaming and stuff, but generally it can take that form. Now, there's nothing wrong with wanting or desiring or emotions or feelings. Desire is a fine thing. It's one of the things that keeps us alive. But desires are terrible masters. They are not good when they are in control of your life. The objects of desire may differ. I may want to eat or sleep. I may want to dominate others. I may want great wealth. Taken by themselves, desires are inherently chaotic and deceitful. Let me just read for a sec out of the book of James about desires. This is beginning in chapter 4, but I want to finish, I'm going to start in the end of chapter 3 because it flows into it. And it talks about wisdom. It says, who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom, meaning that comes from envy or self-seeking, this wisdom does not descend from above, for where envy, but is earthly, sensual, demonic. That is the wisdom that has envy and self-seeking behind it. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, and I would say pure of envy and self-seeking in it. And then he goes on, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. And then it gets into chapter 4, where he says, where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure? For your desires for pleasure, that is the object you want, and nothing else matters. I want to get what I want. And that's where wars and fights among us come from. And they war in your members, they war in our bodies. You lust, and all lust is just the flesh, a part of your flesh that is out of control, and it is driving you, it is leading you. You can have take the appetite for food, and if all you do is eat, and that's all that fills your mind, and you've got to eat, you got to eat, that has gone from an appetite to a lust. So you lust and you do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and you do not receive because you ask amiss that you may spend it on your pleasures. Meaning that you're asking for something so that you can just fill your desire. You're not asking so that you can live for him who died for you. You're asking because I want this and I want it now. And as we get older, like I said, if you take an impulsive child, we can see them throwing a temper tantrum. As we get older, we learn how to mask those things and how to put them in ways to actually get what we want without actually looking like that's what we're doing. Sometimes it does, sometimes it breaks out. Look at social media, and I will tell you, you see that kind of stuff all the time. But it happens in our hearts, and it happens in our lives. Desire is to possess or experience something, what I want, and I want it now. In our natural state, apart from God, our fleshly lusts wage against the soul. This is what 1 Peter 2 says. Our fleshly lusts wage against the soul. They war against ourselves. Yeah, we war against other people, but they war against ourselves. Desires can conflict with other desires that we have in ourselves, and we become conflicted, and this is where we find so much trouble. I can desire to have a great marriage, but I can also desire to want my own way above everybody else, even above Karen's. Now, when those two desires, they are both going for what they are looking for, and the one who's stronger wins out. And I'll tell you which one's stronger a lot of the time is that I want to have my own way, and my other desires get subjugated to that. Now here where it says that the fleshly lust wage against the soul should be understood as your whole person. And the war involves the very center of the person, the human heart, will, or spirit. And if you just can think of, I've heard things like soul and heart and will and spirit and mind, all these things defined in many, many ways. The way that I've come to understand it is that basically the heart, will, and spirit, you can consider that those are the same thing. They're just different parts of it. So like the heart means it's at your center, the center of who you are in your heart. The will is the function of what goes on in the center of your heart. Your will is the one that chooses, and spirit is just its nature. It's non-physical, it's spiritual. And so, if you think about it, our spirit is different from unrestrained flesh, with its singular focus on satisfying desire. Unrestrained flesh has a singular focus on satisfying the desire that's driving it. Now it's different in that the spirit is able to consider alternatives, where the flesh or desire is not. All it can see is it's what it wants, and everything else is blocked out. The spirit is able to take a step back and to consider alternatives. And God prompts us there to have an interest in not just this desire, but what might be better and what might even be the best thing for us to do. It is our God-given ability as He comes and meets with us in our lives to give us this interest in being able to see what is better and what is best, and then to go with that. It brings perspective, and it takes a broad view of the possibilities before us, because it doesn't just show us that one thing in front of us that we want and desire so much. It gives us a broad view of the possibilities before us, not just of one desire and its object, but of other desires, as well as things that are good that might be chosen. And this is exactly where choice comes in, which is the function of the will. Choice involves deliberation between alternatives, thinking things through. This desire may be nothing wrong with this desire, and it may fit in well with it's lunchtime. I'm hungry. Here's some food. I've got nothing going on. It's a good time for me to eat lunch. But it also may be I need to put it aside because I have this important thing I need to do. So choice involves deliberation between alternatives with a view to what is best, not just what I want, but what is best. The conflict between the flesh and the human spirit is the conflict between desire, or what I want, and the will for what is best. And in reality, it's the conflict between desire and love, because love is always directed towards what is good, and not simply at having my desire satisfied. Love is the will to or for the good of the object it's looking at, as opposed to desire that just wants it, to possess it, or to experience it. Love always looks at an object, and it is always for the good of that object, which is the opposite of desire. The relationship between the good that love seeks and our fleshly desires is revealed, for instance, for many, many times, but certainly in Jesus' teaching about anger and cultivated lust in the Sermon on the Mount, which are the first two topics he hits when he gets to the point in chapter 5 where he says, and your righteousness needs to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. And basically he's saying this is the righteousness of the kingdom of God, as opposed to the righteousness of the world, even the religious world. And he says things like, he starts off by saying, you've heard it said, don't murder. He says, but I'm telling you, do not even be angry. And he goes from anger to contempt and hatred and mocking, and he shows that those underlying conditions are the same thing that's where murder comes from. And then he goes from there and he talks about cultivated lust. And I believe he starts with anger because that's the biggest one. If you could just imagine one day in this world, if you could remove anger from everybody, everything in this world for one day, it would be impossible to even imagine what this world would look like. But getting back to this, let's look at this. The desire that's embedded in both anger and sexual lust is not at all concerned with the good of the object, right? If I'm angry at you, my anger does not consider your good at all. Or if I am lustful towards you, it is not thinking of you at all, but it's thinking of me. And it's only concerned with its own satisfaction. In the case of anger, it can be the desire to have the object suffer in some way. Like, I might want to punch you in the face, I'm so angry with you. Or I've told the story before, and this is true, I've caught myself this, when somebody cuts me off or is driving dangerously or something on the road that makes me angry, I imagine that I've got buttons like on a Top Gun plane, and I've got missiles, and I can shoot missiles, and I want to see that car with that person in it blown up. And that plays out in my mind, and I want that to happen. My desire is to have that person, that car, suffer in some way. If I'm really angry at you, I want to punch you. I want to do something to you because you're thwarting my will. Because that's where anger really comes from, is having our will thwarted, and we don't like that. In the case of sexual lust, it's the desire that the object would provide sensual pleasure. Desire says, let's have sex. Love says, there's a greater good at issue here, the purity of human love and faithfulness towards other human beings, which goes into a whole nother idea of how we even look at people. That God's got a created order in which sex holds a sacred place between a man and a woman when they're married, but it has been assaulted from every direction and driven by unrestrained desire, so much so that in our world and in our schools and everywhere we go, the prevailing understanding of what that is so far away from what God has shown forth that is good for you and me, and it is a good way to go, and the good way to live, it's laughed at and is even questioned by people in the church because we don't see that. We're just inundated with this other message. In both anger and lust, love, which is the essence of all the laws of God, and which is to be the driving motivation of all of our actions, is absent. There is no love in anger. There is no love in lust, sexual lust. And the flesh is enthroned. It's in charge. And it runs and drives us. Now, next week, I want to talk a little bit about where our will comes into play, because we tend to think that it's all about a choice. Just make the choice. And while that is important, and that is definitely needs to be done, in many of our cases, our wills are not as strong and capable as we really believe they are. So I want to talk about that next week. But I wanted to read one little bit out of the Imitation of Christ. Again, just from the introduction, where they say a lot of things that he talks about. I just want to do two little things and make an application here. They say this. It says in the preface: above all, Thomas à Kempis insists on the central Christian obligation emphasized by St. Paul to take up the cross of Christ. Then it quotes this: Jesus today has many lovers of his heavenly kingdom, but few of them carry his cross. Now he's writing this in the 1400s. Could be written today. Jesus today has many lovers of his heavenly kingdom, but few of them carry his cross. He has many friends who ask for consolation. That's an old-time word, basically when they want to be consoled or comforted, but few who pray for affliction. He has many companions to share his meals, but few to share his abstinence. And then that's the end quote. It goes on to say, it is in our interest to follow Jesus in his suffering. If we do not learn to carry our cross voluntarily, we shall not be prepared to cope with pain and conflict when it arrives, as it invariably does. And I believe that we see that today with all the stuff going on. I see that in our lives, that if we don't die to ourselves and do the things in our lives to help us do that, when the hard times come, which they always will, we will be unprepared in the sense that we will have a harder time going through it than if we had taken the time and the investment to walk that road before then. I'm not saying that you could ever get away from things. I'm just saying that this is the way to walk through things in a mature way, in a grown-up way, in a way of the kingdom. Then there's one last thing I think that is applicable today. It's interesting because he does talk a lot about things that in a dark period of time. And it says, the darkness that surrounded Thomas à Kempis and those he guided included the memory of the Black Plague and famine that had wiped out half the population of Europe in the previous century, and the reality of the 100-Year War that was still in progress. Then he goes on to say, it was a time of decline in Europe and a period of scandal and dissension in the church. And the interesting thing was, as I read that, I thought, that's interesting. The memory of the Black Plague and famine that Europe had gone through, where so many people had died. We're going through a pandemic now, and there's pain, there's fear, there's death, there's sickness, we are not in the same place as that. But it just was interesting that he's talking to people who are going through dark times, and he's saying, we are not ready for these unless we learn how to die to ourselves and to live to Christ. And if we can live to Christ, we can have joy. It doesn't mean that we have joy about the pain, but we can have joy and a life that is good and full and abundant, even in the midst of that. It also says that they were in the midst of the 100 Years War for 100 years. That's a long time. This country is in a war. It has been for quite some time, longer than the last few years. It's been for quite some times, and we are seeing it more and more. I mean, this week has been totally insane with some of the crazy stuff going on here. There's anger and hatred and even murder going on in the name of protesting the death of somebody. Stuff goes on over here, and 20 some other people are killed in the rioting and the protesting and everything. What are we doing? This is people left to their own devices, trying to work through their hatred and their anger, trying to see justice done, but trying to do it through politics, trying to do it through the only resources that they have available to them, and that's themselves. And this is not a left or right issue. It's not a Democrat or a Republican issue. I would say, as I've said so many times, if you find yourself, I'm not saying that there's not good in both, but if you find yourself towing the line of either side, you're not towing God's line. There's a different way to do this. There's a different way to fight the darkness. And you don't fight the darkness with darkness. You fight it with light. There's another way. Without anger, without fear, a life that is living without lack, a life without fear, who's being taken care of, a life that can be described this way. Let's try this. Let's try living a life where we don't love our friends and hate our enemies, but we love our friends and we love our enemies. And we do good to those that persecute, even those that persecute us, and do good for them and bless them. There's a different way to deal with what's going on in this world. And that's where I think that the last part of that paragraph said that there was scandal and dissension in the church. And the scandal in the church, I believe, is that we have not done things like this, and we are not mature enough to be the light that we're called to be. The city on the hill, the light to the world. We are caught up in all the emotion and all the stuff as almost as much, if not as much, as everybody else. And so instead of the church having this life of Jesus to present to the world, we are divided amongst ourselves. I know churches that do not like other churches because of political stances they have. It's crazy. It doesn't mean that there's not right and there's not wrong, but the fact that we are like that, to me, is a scandal, that we are divided. What is the solution? I would say that we start this. We should live no longer to ourselves, but for him who died and rose again. Go back to that James chapter 3, chapter 4 thing where it talks about the wisdom that comes from below. The demonic is envy and self-seeking, as opposed to that which is pure and peaceful, willing to yield. I don't see any of that out in the world today. Let us be these people, and the only way we can do that is that we no longer live for ourselves, and the only way for us to do that is to die to ourselves, to take off the old man, and to live for him who died and rose for us, and to put on the new man and the new life that he's given us. So, as we prepare to come back together next week, and we look at what is God doing in this time, I think it's a time for us, his people, to wake up. And we've kind of been removed from the regular world for a while, and hopefully we're looking at the priorities, and hopefully the things that we're learning over the past few months have been things that are important. And I think this is a time for us to wake up. It's important because we need it, I need it, you need it, and this world needs it. This world needs to see Jesus. So with that, let me go ahead and pray, and we'll close it up for this week. Father, I thank you for the life that you've given us in Jesus. I'm sorry for all the time of every day that I don't walk according to your Spirit, that I don't walk according and for him, but my mind is always filled with what I want and my desire. And yes, there are moments when I put those aside and I look to you. But Lord, my desire is to do that more and more. And I thank you for a church, a body that even though we're small, I see people that are walking this out and working on this and growing up and maturing before my very eyes. And I just ask for you to come and fill us, fall on us, fill us, bring us together, make us one, even as you are one, that we might be everything that you have created us to be. In Jesus' name, amen. So, next week's Father's Day, that'll be a great time. If you can remember, Saturday the 20th, the day before Father's Day, is my birthday, so that's really cool. And but I'll see you on Sunday at church. So until then, trust Jesus, do good, and wash your hands.